The curse of perfection. Adaze did not walk, she glided. In the village of Umuoka, her beauty was a heavy crown. Her skin was the color of polished mahogany, and her eyes held the depth of a midnight well. But inside that beautiful chest beat a heart of cold stone. Adaze, the son of the high chief, has come with 3 kegs of palm wine, her mother whispered, her voice trembling with hope. Adaze didn't even look up from her mirror. He has a crooked tooth, mother. Do you want me to wake up to a monster every morning? She had rejected the strongest hunters, the wealthiest traders, and even a prince from the neighboring kingdom. She believed she was crafted by the gods for something more than a mortal man. But in the shadows of the forest, the spirits were listening. They do not like pride. They find it delicious. The Red Moon Festival. The festival was supposed to be a night of joy, but for Adaze, it was just another stage to be adored. She wore her finest beads, the click-clack of the coral sounding like a heartbeat. The drums were loud, the fire was high, and the air smelled of roasted yam and sweat. Then, the music stopped. A man walked into the circle. He was taller than any man in Umuoka. He wore robes of silk that shimmered like oil on water. His face was so perfect it looked carved from moonlight. Every woman gasped, every man felt small. Adaze felt her cold heart give a sudden, violent throb. This was him. The one she had been waiting for. The man from nowhere. The stranger approached Adaze. He didn't ask for permission from her father. He simply reached out a hand. His skin was ice-cold, but Adaze didn't pull away. I have traveled across 7 rivers to find the flower of Umuoka, he said. His voice sounded like wind blowing through a graveyard, hollow and beautiful. What is your name? Adaze asked, her pride finally crumbling into curiosity. They call me Azaka, he replied. As they danced, the villagers whispered. But one old woman, the blind seer, gripped her staff. She couldn't see his face, but she felt the air grow thin around him. There is no heartbeat in that dance, she hissed, but her voice was lost in the drums. The missing shadow. The moon was directly overhead, casting sharp black shapes on the ground. Adaze's father, a cautious man, watched the couple from the shadows. He looked at his daughter's feet. There was a long, dark shadow stretching behind her. Then he looked at Azaka's feet. There was nothing. The dust beneath the stranger's sandals was bright and clear. The man cast no shadow. The father tried to scream, but his throat felt like it was filled with dry sand. Azaka turned his head, not his body, just his head, and looked directly at the father. He smiled, and for a second, his teeth looked like rows of needles. The price of a soul. The next morning, Azaka presented the dowry. It wasn't palm wine or goats. He brought chests of gold that didn't shine quite right and ivory that felt like human bone. Adaze's mother was blinded by the wealth, but her father was paralyzed by fear. I take her today, Azaka stated. It wasn't a request. Adaze was packed and ready. She didn't say goodbye to her friends. She didn't hug her mother. She only looked at the gold. I told you all, she mocked the village girls. I was meant for a king. She stepped into the forest with her husband, leaving the world of the living behind. The 7 rivers. They walked for hours, yet Adaze felt no fatigue. The forest grew silent. The birds stopped chirping, and the leaves turned a bruised purple. They reached the first river. To cross, Azaka said, you must give up your beads. They belong to the earth. Adaze took them off and threw them in. But as they crossed the 3rd and 4th rivers, the path grew darker. She looked at her husband. His silk robes were beginning to fray, revealing gray, leathery skin beneath. Azaka. How much further? Just until the light dies, my love, he whispered. The borrowed parts. By the 6th river, the stranger's beauty began to peel away like old paint. One of his eyes fell out, and he didn't pick it up. He simply plucked a smooth stone from the ground and pressed it into the socket. What is happening to you? Adaze shrieked. I am returning what I borrowed, he laughed. The nose was from a merchant in the east. The hair was from a dead prince. I am only a collection of things people threw away. Adaze tried to run back, but the trees moved to block her path. The forest was no longer a place of trees. It was a cage of ribs. The house of bones. They reached a clearing where a hut stood. It wasn't made of mud and thatch. The walls were stacked skulls, and the roof was woven from human hair. "Welcome home, Adaze," the thing that was once Azaka said. He was now a twisted creature with elongated limbs and a hole where his heart should be. He didn't want a wife. He wanted a mirror. He wanted someone beautiful to sit in the dark so he could watch her beauty fade and feed off her despair. Adaze realized then that her pride hadn't brought her a king, it had brought her a consumer. The first night. Inside the hut, there was no bed, only a cold stone slab. Azaka sat in the corner, clicking his needle teeth. "If you cry," he warned, "I will drink your tears. They taste like salt and regret." Adaze stayed awake, listening to the sounds of the forest spirits scratching at the walls. She thought of the hunters she had laughed at. She thought of the chief's son with the crooked tooth. How beautiful his crooked smile seemed now. She realized that perfection is a mask that the devil wears to get close to the proud. The mirror of truth. In the center of the room sat a bowl of black water. Azaka forced Adaze to look into it. She didn't see her face. She saw her soul. It was a small, shriveled thing, black from years of vanity. "You see," Azaka hissed. "We are the same. You looked at men and saw only their flaws. I look at humans and see only their parts. We are both collectors of ghosts." Adaze wept, but she remembered his warning. She swallowed her tears, her throat burning like she was drinking acid. The father's journey. Back in Umuoka, Adaze's father could not sleep. The image of the shadowless man haunted his dreams. He went to the blind seer. "She is in the land of the borrowed," the seer said, her voice a raspy crawl. "You cannot fight him with a spear. You must fight him with what he lacks." The father took a small pouch of salt and a mirror that had been cracked into 3 pieces. He stepped into the forest, following the scent of rotting lilies. He knew he might never come back, but the blood of his daughter called to him from the dark. The second river's toll. The father reached the second river. A spirit rose from the water, a woman with hair made of drowning vines. "Give me your sight, and you may pass," she demanded. The father didn't hesitate. He tied a cloth over his eyes. "I do not need my eyes to find my daughter. I will follow the sound of her heartbeat." The spirit, moved by a love she hadn't felt in centuries, let him pass. But the forest was getting colder, and the shadows were beginning to bite. The forest did not want Adaze's father to pass. The trees here were not made of wood. They were made of calcified grief, their branches like reaching skeletal fingers that snagged his clothes and tore at his aged skin. He reached the bank of the second river, the river of lost visions. He began to recoil, terrified by a love they could not consume. The hunger of Azaka. In the House of Bones, Azaka was growing hungry. He didn't eat food. He ate presence. He sat close to Adaze, breathing in her scent, and as he did, her skin began to grow pale and gray. "Stop," she begged. "You are taking my life." "I am making you like me," he replied. "Soon, you will have no shadow. Soon, you will be able to walk through walls and steal the breath of sleeping children. Isn't that what you wanted? To be more than human?" Adaze realized her beauty was her life, and it was being drained into the void of the monster. In the House of Bones, time did not flow, it rotted. There was no sun to mark the hours, only the slow, rhythmic ticking of Azaka's needle teeth. He no longer wore the silk robes of a prince. They had dissolved into a gray, oily film that clung to his skeletal frame like a second skin. Azaka was changing. The borrowed beauty was failing him because he had no soul to hold the pieces together. He was starving, but he did not crave meat or water. He craved presence. He craved the vibrant golden life force that still flickered inside Adaze's chest. "Sit closer, my bride," he whispered, his voice a dry rattle like stones in a hollow gourd. He didn't touch her with hands. He touched her with his shadow, or the lack of one. A cold, numbing void crept across the stone floor, climbing up Adaze's legs. Wherever the void touched, her skin turned the color of wood ash. The warmth in her blood began to crystallize into ice. "Stop," Adaze pleaded, her voice cracking like a parched riverbed. "You are taking my life." I can feel my heart slowing. I can feel my memories fading. I am not taking, Azaka hissed, his neck elongating until his face was inches from hers. His stone eye remained cold, but the yellow one glowed with a sickening, predatory hunger. I am sharing. Soon, your skin will be as gray as mine. Your eyes will forget the color of the sun. You will be a beautiful statue in my gallery of ghosts. Isn't that what you wanted? To be set apart from the common people? To be untouchable? He leaned in and inhaled deeply, drawing the very air from her lungs. Adeze felt a terrifying hollowness. She tried to remember the face of her mother, but it was blurry, like an image seen through smoke. She tried to remember the smell of the village market, but all she could smell was the sulfur and old bone of the hut. You were so proud of these hands, Azaka mocked, stroking her fingers with his jagged wooden claws. They never carried water. They never tilled the soil. They were too royal for work. Now, they will never touch anything again. As he spoke, Adeze noticed her fingernails were turning black and brittle. The tips of her fingers were becoming transparent. She could see the dark, stagnant mist of the land of the borrowed through her own flesh. She wasn't just dying, she was being unmade. Azaka let out a low, guttural moan of satisfaction. The more you despair, the sweeter you taste. Your pride was a seasoning, Adeze. It made your soul so succulent. He opened his mouth wide, wider than any human jaw could stretch, and a swarm of translucent, moth-like spirits flew out, fluttering around Adeze's head. They were the whispers of the other girls he had taken, the ones who had also been too beautiful for their own worlds. They circled her, weeping in silent, high-pitched frequencies that made her ears bleed. Adeze realized with a jolt of pure horror that she wasn't his wife. She was his battery. She was the fuel that kept his nightmare existence from collapsing into nothingness. "Please," she whimpered, her tears freezing on her cheeks before they could fall. "Cry all you want," Azaka grinned, his face splitting into a jagged mask of malice. "In this house, even your sorrow belongs to me." The echo in the woods. Adeze's father was stumbling, his feet bleeding. He started to sing a song Adeze's mother used to sing when she was a baby. It was a simple song about a bird that flew too high and burned its wings. Inside the hut, Adeze heard a faint sound. It wasn't the wind. It was her father's voice. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel shame for her humble origins. She felt a desperate, clawing love. She began to hum the melody, her voice cracking. The darkness of the land of the borrowed was not just a lack of light. It was a living, breathing weight. It pressed against Adeze's skin like wet wool, smelling of ancient dust and the copper tang of dried blood. Inside the House of Bones, the silence was its own kind of torture. It was a silence that screamed. Azaka sat in the corner, his borrowed limbs clicking as he readjusted his stolen joints. His eyes, one a dull stone, the other a flickering yellow light, were fixed on her. He was waiting for her spirit to finally snap, like a dry twig under a predator's boot. "Your mother has already forgotten you," Azaka hissed, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering over a grave. "She is busy counting the leaves that used to be gold. Your father is likely dead in the thorns. No one comes for the proud, Adeze. They only come for the useful." Adeze felt a hollow ache in her chest. She looked at her hands. They were becoming translucent, the bones visible beneath the fading skin. She was disappearing. Then it came. It was faint, so faint it could have been the heartbeat of a moth. A low, trembling vibration through the floor of skulls. "My little bird, with wings so bright." Adeze froze. Her breath hitched in her throat, tasting like the ash of the fires Azaka forced her to tend. It was a song from another life. A life of warm yam pottage, the smell of wood smoke, and the calloused, steady hands of her father. "You flew so high, you touched the sun." "Shut up!" Azaka roared, his neck extending like a serpent's as he glared at the walls. "There is no music here. Only the wind." But the voice grew louder, cracked with exhaustion and raw with pain. It wasn't just a song, it was a trail of breadcrumbs made of sound. Adeze could hear the struggle in the melody, the sound of her father's lungs burning, the sound of his feet being shredded by the cursed brambles of the 7 rivers. "But the earth is waiting, my little one." Each note was a dagger of guilt to Adeze's heart. He was blind. He was old. He had every reason to stay in the safety of the village and mourn the daughter who had looked down her nose at his humble life. Yet, here he was, walking into the mouth of hell. "Papa," she whispered, her voice a ghost of its former self. "He cannot hear you," Azaka shrieked, his face splitting open to reveal the darkness within. "I will tear the song from his throat and feed it to the crows. I will make him watch. Oh, wait, he is already blind. I will make him feel your soul dissolve." Adaze didn't pull away this time. As the song grew closer, a spark of something hotter than vanity ignited in her gut. It was a dark, desperate love. She realized that while she had spent her life looking for a king to crown her, a simple man was currently crowning her with his own life. She began to hum. It was a low, mournful sound, vibrating against the stone slab. "Stop it!" Azaka lunged, his fingers, now cold, jagged sticks, clutching at her throat. But the more he throttled her, the louder the echo became. The House of Bones began to groan. The skulls in the walls started to chatter, their hollow eyes reflecting the rhythm of a father's love. The hook was set. The father was no longer just a man in the woods. He was a hunter following a heartbeat, and the monster was finally the one who should be afraid. The monster's rage. Azaka roared. The sound shook the skulls on the wall. "Who is calling you? No one comes here. This is the place where things are forgotten." He lunged at Adaze, his fingers turning into long wooden talons. He pinned her to the stone slab. "I will take your voice first," he snarled. But as he reached for her throat, the door of the hut burst open. A blind man stood there, covered in mud and blood, holding a broken mirror. The House of Bones groaned as if the very foundations were in pain. Inside, the air had turned into a thick, suffocating soup of rot and malice. Azaka was no longer pretending to be a man. His spine had elongated, snapping and cracking as it pushed through his leathery skin like a jagged ridge of mountain rock. "He is here," Azaka hissed, his voice now a multitonal screech that echoed from the skulls in the walls. "The old fool has crawled through the mud to find a daughter who never even loved him." Adaze lay on the stone slab, her body so thin and gray she looked like a shadow cast by a candle. She could hear the heavy, wet thud of footsteps outside. Thud. Drag. Thud. Her father was stumbling, his hands scraping against the bone walls of the hut, searching for the entrance. "Papa, run!" she tried to scream, but her voice was a dry rasp, no louder than the rubbing of insect wings. "Silence!" Azaka roared. He lunged at her, his fingers, now long wooden talons tipped with rusted iron, hooking into the stone on either side of her head. "I will take your voice first. I will weave it into a shroud and wrap it around his neck until he stops breathing." He reached for her throat, his jaw unhinging to reveal rows of needle teeth that dripped with a black, acidic bile. But just as his claws grazed her skin, the door, a heavy slab made of fused rib cages, wasn't just opened, it was shattered. The blind father stood in the doorway. He was a vision of nightmares. His eyes were sunken pits of darkness, his clothes were ribbons of blood-soaked rags, and his skin was mapped with 1,000 thorns. But in his hand, he gripped the 3 shards of the broken mirror. "Azaka!" the father shouted, his voice booming with a power that shook the very dust from the ceiling. "You took my sight, but you forgot that the heart does not need eyes to find a demon." Azaka laughed, a sound like glass grinding against bone. He crawled up the wall, his limbs moving with the sickening speed of a spider. "A blind man. You come to save her when you cannot even see the horror I have become? Look at her, old man. She is fading. She is almost mine." The monster dropped from the ceiling, his talons aimed directly at the father's heart. But the father didn't flinch. He didn't move. He sensed the rush of cold air, the scent of sulfur, and the vibration of the monster's scream. At the very last second, he thrust the broken mirror shards upward. "I do not need to see you," the father cried out, the blood from his own hands slicking the glass. "I only need you to see yourself." The moonlight, red and vengeful, struck the shards. The light didn't just reflect, it multiplied, bouncing off the jagged edges and filling the dark hut with a blinding, holy brilliance. For the first time in 1,000 years, the void that was Azaka was forced to look into the truth of its own emptiness. The reflection. "Azaka!" the father shouted. The monster laughed, a sound like breaking glass. A blind man. You come to save her when you cannot even see the horror I have become. I don't need to see you, the father said. He held up the 3 pieces of the broken mirror. The moonlight hit the shards, and the light bounced around the room. Even though the father was blind, the mirror acted as a trap. Azaka, who had no shadow and no soul, saw himself for the first time in 1,000 years. The shattering. When Azaka saw his reflection in the broken glass, he screamed. The mirror didn't show a powerful spirit, it showed a vacuum, a hole in the universe that was trying to fill itself with stolen pieces. The borrowed parts began to fly off him. The silk robes turned to dust. The stone eye rolled away. The needle teeth fell like rain. The house of bones began to collapse. "Run, Adaze!" her father cried, feeling for her hand in the chaos. The escape. They ran through the forest, but the spirits were angry. The trees tripped them, and the vines lashed at their skin. Adaze had to lead her blind father, reversing their roles. "I'm sorry, Papa," she sobbed as they crossed the rivers. The air in the House of Bones didn't just vibrate, it began to tear. As the shards of the mirror caught Azaka's gaze, the glamour, the ancient, sticky magic that held his stolen form together, melted away like fat over a fire. The scream that tore from his throat wasn't a single voice. It was a discordant howl of 1,000 stolen souls finally reclaiming their essence. The great unmaking. The physical world around Adaze began to dissolve into its true, horrific components. The shedding of self, the handsome jawline Azaka had worn shifted and cracked. The prince's skin, once smooth as polished mahogany, shriveled into gray, translucent parchment before fluttering away as ash. The reign of thieves, the needle teeth he had boasted of didn't just fall, they shot out of his gums like shrapnel, clattering against the skull walls. The stone he had used for an eye rolled across the floor, losing its light until it was just a common, dirty pebble. The weight of truth, the heavy gold chests in the corner didn't just change, they curdled. The shimmering metal turned into wet, stinking mud and heaps of dried, yellowed leaves that smelled of the grave. The collapse of the nightmare. The hut itself, built on the vanity of the lost, could no longer sustain its own weight. The skulls in the walls began to wail, their hollow sockets weeping black ichor as the hair-woven roof unspooled like a rotting tapestry. "You are nothing," the father roared, his voice thick with the authority of a man who had sacrificed his sight for a greater vision. He stood steady even as the ground beneath him groaned and buckled. Adaze, her strength returning as the creature's presence faded, felt her father's calloused blood-streaked hand find hers. It was the only solid thing in a world of dissolving shadows. "I have you," he whispered, his sightless eyes turned toward the door. "The mirror has spoken the truth, and the truth has no room for him." Behind them, the thing that had been Azaka was now a mere smudge of darkness, a frantic, swirling vortex of smoke and grief, clawing at the air for pieces of a life it never owned. The House of Bones groaned one last time and began to fold in on itself, sinking into the hungry earth of the land of the borrowed. "Don't speak," he gasped. "Just keep your eyes on the sunrise." But the 7th river was rising. The water was black and thick. It didn't want them to leave. It wanted to keep the beauty and the sacrifice for itself. The sacrifice of pride. To cross the final river, a price had to be paid. The river spirit appeared, a giant serpent with the face of a child. "One stays, one goes," it hissed. Adaze looked at her father, tired, blind, and dying for her. She looked at her own hands, which were still pale and ghostly. "I will stay," Adaze said. "Let him go back to his wife." She stepped into the water, prepared to drown. But because she finally chose someone else over herself, the water turned to clear glass. The curse of the stranger with no shadow was broken by an act of selfless love. The return to Umuoka. They stumbled into the village as the sun rose. The villagers gathered, gasping at the sight. Adaze was no longer the glowing beauty she once was. Her hair was short, her skin was scarred by vines, and she walked with a limp. Her father was blind, but smiled as he felt the warmth of his home. The gold Azaka had given the mother had turned into a pile of dry leaves and dung. The village realized that the perfect suitor had been a demon, the new beauty. Years passed. Adaze never married a prince. She married a local widower who had lost his leg in a hunt. They were not a perfect couple to look at, but their house was filled with laughter and shadows. Adais spent her days teaching the young girls of the village. She didn't teach them how to braid hair or apply oils. She taught them to look at a man's shadow before his face. True beauty, she would say, touching the scar on her arm, is what remains when the moonlight fades. Beware of anything that looks too perfect. The gods give us flaws so that love has a place to rest. The seventh river did not flow with water. It flowed with the memory of everything the forest had ever consumed. It was a thick, obsidian sludge that hummed with the resentment of the forgotten. The guardian of the threshold. As they reached the muddy bank, the surface broke with a sickening, rhythmic slosh. The creature that rose was a contradiction of nightmares. It had the massive, scaled coils of a python, thick as a baobab tree, but where the head should have been sat the soft, porcelain face of a human infant. Its eyes were vast and unblinking, reflecting not the world, but the deepest regrets of those who stood before it. "The border is closed," the child face whispered, its voice echoing from the bottom of a well. "The land of the borrowed does not offer refunds. To pay for the life of the father, the daughter must remain. To pay for the life of the daughter, the father must sink. One stays. One goes. The ultimate choice." Adais felt the coldness of the river spirit's gaze. She looked at her father. He was a shadow of the man who had raised her. His back was bowed under the weight of her mistakes. His eyes, once bright with pride for her, were now milky and still. He had walked through a hell of thorns and bone for a girl who had once been ashamed to be seen with him. For the first time, the mirror in her mind didn't show her own face. It showed his sacrifice. "No," Adais said, her voice finally finding its strength. She stepped forward, her feet sinking into the black muck. "He has already paid with his sight. He has paid with his blood. I am the one who invited the darkness in. I will stay." "Adais, no!" her father cried, reaching out blindly, his fingers catching only the damp air. She didn't look back. She waded deeper until the black water reached her waist, then her chest. "Go home, Papa. Tell Mother. Tell her I finally found my crown." The transfiguration. As she prepared for the water to fill her lungs, something miraculous happened. The moment her heart truly surrendered its vanity, the moment she prioritized another soul over her own survival, the obsidian sludge began to vibrate. A sound like 1,000 silver bells rang through the forest. The black ink of the river bleached into a shimmering, crystalline transparency. The child serpent let out a sigh of release, its scales turning into white lilies before it dissolved into the current. The water became solid, a bridge of clear glass beneath her feet. The curse of Azaka, which relied on the selfishness of his victims to sustain itself, shattered. The dawn at Umuoka. They didn't return as conquerors, they returned as survivors. The sun was a bruised purple and orange when they broke through the final tree line. The village of Umuoka was just waking up. The smell of wood smoke and roasting maize hit Adais like a physical blow, more beautiful than any perfume she had ever coveted. The sight of the fallen, the villagers stopped in their tracks. They didn't see the queen of the forest. They saw a woman whose fine blue robes were rags, whose skin was a map of jagged white scars from the thorn vines, and whose hair had been hacked short by the spirits of the river. The father's triumph. Beside her, her father leaned heavily on a staff, his face upturned to a son he could no longer see. He wasn't weeping. He was smiling, a radiant, peaceful expression that made his weathered face look more regal than Azaka ever had. The leaf and the dung. In the center of the village, Adais' mother sat by the chests of gold. As the sun touched the metal, the glamour finally died. The coins didn't just tarnish, they shriveled into dry, bitter leaves and mounds of animal dung. The wealth that had blinded the village was revealed as the rot it always was. Adais walked past the piles of refuse without a glance. She didn't look at the village girls who stood open-mouthed. She looked only at her home, a simple hut of mud and thatch, and realized that for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was meant to be.